Ukraine has a manpower problem. The war has dragged on for more than 2 years now. Ukraine has lost, by its count, tens of thousands of soldiers, though Western intelligence suspects that's an undercount. Ukraine has had to tighten its conscription net, drafting younger men and increasing penalties for draft dodgers. But then, a development we haven't seen before.
For the first time since the Russian invasion, the Ukrainian military is launching a large-scale assault inside Russia.
There is a state of emergency in place in the region. Thousands of people have been evacuated. Several have been killed and dozens injured.
These aren't the kinds of headlines the world expected from a country that spent most of this war on the ropes. There have been other attacks on Russian territory, but so far only ever on a much smaller scale. Drone strikes in Belgorod, long-range missile strikes on supply depots, even suspected sabotage operations, which Ukraine rarely confirms nor denies. They haven't actually said anything about this latest offensive either, but a mechanized brigade, shown here in Russian Defense Ministry video, well-trained, well-equipped, rolling right onto Russian soil. As the attack unfolded, Russian state media estimated at least hundreds of Ukrainian soldiers, 11 tanks, more than 20 armored vehicles. CBC hasn't verified this, but all over Telegram, a fierce Russian response. Vladimir Putin called the attack a major provocation, and military experts say Russia appeared to be caught completely by surprise. But consider the risk involved, spending military might that can always be used elsewhere, and to gain relatively little ground.
So in the immediate area where they're fighting, there's nothing particular. It's a border area.
There are three main theories circulating that help explain what Ukraine might stand to gain from this kind of offensive. The first two are military considerations, but the last one has nothing to do with fighting at all. We all know the adage, the best defense is a good offense. In war, this is about attacking the enemy's strengths, which can be transportation or supply lines, and it can be a way of applying pressure, forcing the enemy to divert their resources.
This attack in no way is going to change the strategic military equation, no. But what it does do, it changes the tactical tempo, and it's like what we would call positional fighting.
This is a time-lapse from the Institute for the Study of War, that's a US-based think tank, showing Russian gains since the start of the war. The outlines in black, Russian-controlled, even before the war. But the regions in red, Ukraine has managed to push back Russian advances throughout the country. But to the south and the east, Russia has not only gained ground, but held it too. This is where, in recent months, we've seen the fiercest fighting. But one military analyst told the BBC after the recent Ukrainian attack on Russian soil, there were significantly fewer Russian glide bombs dropped in the Donetsk area. That means, he continues, the aircraft which carry them are now elsewhere in Russia.
Could it be that they hope to draw some forces away? Yes. And for that, we have to see whether the Russians can snuff out this latest Ukrainian move into Kursk Oblast, or whether the Ukrainians can keep their forces in the field and move deeper in.
If the goal of the Ukrainian offensive was to divert resources away from this eastern front, Donetsk is here, only about 400 kilometers from where Ukraine pushed into Russia's Kursk region. An easy trip for a fighter jet. And in this unverified video obtained by Reuters, we see two Russian fighter jets zooming overhead as black smoke from a burning vehicle wafts into the air from the Russian side of the border. But it's impossible to know where those jets came from. And ultimately, there is a problem with this theory. Russia's army is really big.
So there's been you can say, a minor disruption to Russian resources. Yes, they are committing resources, but the Russians have a lot of reserves.
It seems unlikely that the Russians would divert large numbers of troops to deal with this Ukrainian offensive because they have troops that can be brought in from elsewhere. So that strikes me as not a very plausible explanation.
So that's one theory, for what it's worth. Applying pressure in one place to relieve pressure in another. But the second theory is that this attack was actually a diversion for something bigger. I mentioned earlier how Russia seems to have been caught by surprise. The last 72 hours have been an all-out scramble.
A state of emergency has been declared in an area of southwest Russia.
Ukraine's surprise cross-border incursion into Russia's Kursk region has forced Moscow to redeploy troops from the front lines.
Russian state TV showed footage of hollowed-out homes, and parts of the region were evacuated.
More than 200 people were taken out of the war zone by buses and personal vehicles from their territories. During the day, with our help, thousands of people left the shelling zone by private transport.
If Russia is forced to redeploy troops in a more intentional, defensive way, that could open Russia up to counterattack elsewhere. There's no shortage of territory Ukraine would very much like to recapture from Russian control. But most military experts we've spoken to seem to agree this idea that Ukraine could set up some massive attack elsewhere falls apart for one simple reason.
I don't see that happening, actually, because I don't know where the Ukrainians will get the forces to do that.
Yes, the same issue that made Ukraine's recent attack on Russia so surprising to begin with. Where do you get the manpower and the firepower to pull off such a bold attack? No, the leading theory explaining Ukraine's surprise attack is the one that has nothing to do with fighting at all. It's about bargaining power. Even in a war that seems to go on forever, both sides are thinking about the day it ends. And that doesn't necessarily mean a military victory or defeat.
They're trying to change the dynamics of the battlefield to improve their negotiating position at the peace talks.
If there's going to be a negotiated end to the war, it's likely both sides would have to make concessions. So there's a school of thought that capturing land inside Russia, even if it's only a few hundred square kilometers, that's worth something.
This opens the door potentially in a negotiation, particularly if Ukrainians manage to hold some of this territory. If they're holding parts of Russian territory, then they could offer to give it back as a trade for the Russians giving some of Ukrainian territory back.
And there's a clear deadline to make as many gains as possible. Ukraine recently made an offer to Russia. Let's talk. Ukraine's president says he wants to present a plan for what he calls a just peace this November at an international summit. He's invited Putin to attend, and it would be the first time since near the start of the war Zelensky has shown any appetite for direct negotiations at all. But there's something else happening in November as well.
We will win in November.
We will win, win, win.
The outcome of the U.S. presidential election could have a dramatic impact on Ukraine's future. The Biden administration has been very much in Ukraine's corner, making the case to Congress that Ukraine must win. But Donald Trump has said he's looking for a quick resolution.
Let me just put it a nicer way. If I'm president, I will have that war settled in one day, 24 hours.
The Trump-Vance ticket is not pro-Ukrainian. Certainly Vance in particular is not pro-Ukrainian. So they need to stir up some kind of momentum that would show, should the Republicans win, that Ukraine is worth betting on and should be reinforced in negotiations and with more military support.
So to wrap this up, I'll state the obvious. It'll be hard to know for sure what Ukraine's master plan is until something else happens. For example, will Ukraine try to hold its ground inside Russia? But one thing is for sure, we haven't seen this kind of a bold military move from Ukraine since the start of the war, and it's made Russia angry. It calls the attack barbaric and criminal.